Welcome to part 2 in our series on the Family Proclamation. And I want to remind viewers that resources and slides for these presentations are available at navuneighbor.org. And I have links there in the show description here on YouTube. This presentation in the series focuses on gender in the Family Proclamation. And we begin with a simple statement from the Family Proclamation that says gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. And before we continue, we need to acknowledge that this issue is complex and very personal. We need to understand that as we navigate questions of gender, we can't expect that everyone will get it right all the time. Even as we adhere to principles, we need to offer grace and charity and be a loving community that creates a healthy environment for people to work through their challenges in the best way possible. Let's proceed now with a basic discussion. The church treats gender and biological sex as synonymous. In and out of the church, there have always existed gender expressed in biological sex, and there's very little variation there. We have male and female, and then there are people with intersex conditions. But as we will see as we proceed, even those people tend to identify as either male or female. There exist gender roles, and here we have some variation by culture. And then finally, gender stereotypes. And this is where we see a lot of variation by culture. With the rise of critical theory, especially the work of Judith Butler, many people have come to believe that gender and many other areas of life are socially constructed and the product of oppressive social forces. I personally reject the views of people like Judith Butler. But as with most issues, I do like to ask the question, is there some reality that they are trying to speak to, even if they are failing? And I believe in this situation, the answer is sometimes yes. Let's look at a case study in the story of pop star Demi Lovato, who a couple years ago announced a non-binary identity. Well, let's talk about what happened. She came out as non-binary. She said, "This is who I am. Take it or leave it." She did an announcement on Twitter that got millions of views, and people showered her with affirmation and celebration and affection. In one of the articles about her, they said the announcement comes after the singer announced that they are pansexual in March on Joe Rogan's podcast. They recently shared their struggles with addiction in mental health in a YouTube documentary, which chronicled their life before and after a near-fatal overdose in 2018. I feel like the reason why that happened was because I was ignoring my truth and I was suppressing who I really am in order to please stylists or team members or this or that, or even fans that wanted me to be the sexy feminine pop star. Now let's stop here for a minute. We have a lot of language of expectations and gender stereotypes being conveyed by people around Demi Lovato. So you can sense that she felt pressured to conform to stereotypes. And she said, "Now I just realize it's so much more important to live your truth than to ever suppress yourself, because that's the kind of stuff that happens when you do." Another article. Thursday, the singer who came out as non-binary earlier this year and shared they use they-them pronouns opened up about first questioning their gender and sexuality as early as the 4th or 5th grade. Lovato also recalled altering their appearance to reflect an image they didn't totally always identify with. They said they started dressing more masculine while also competing in feminine beauty pageants. I realized, I'm not that girly. And it wasn't until I went to middle school that I completely changed my image and my branding to make myself more digestible for people in middle school, because I just had a sense that they weren't going to be as friendly as they were in elementary school. And sure enough, I was right, they shared. Again, more language of expectations and the idea that she needed to fill some kind of a role for her gender. If you have surrounded yourself with people who have very, very strict expectations as to how you will behave, then sometimes those expectations are going to feel oppressive. And Demi Lovato responded by rejecting them in the form of adopting a non-binary gender. Here's another article. Demi Lovato cut their hair to step away from gender norms. The article says it was a stark change from the old Demi, and it was intentional, they said, to distance themselves from gender norms and expectations. So was this really a process of self-discovery? Did she discover her true self during this process of just rejecting gender expectations and gender norms? Well, look what happened a year later. She says she's using she, her pronouns again. And this other article, Demi Lovato on why they adopted she, her pronouns again. I've been feeling more feminine. And in this final article, she says, everyone messes up pronouns at some point, especially when people are learning, the singer says. It's just all about respect. Now think about what happened here. She changed her pronouns and announced a new identity in a process of self-discovery, claiming that she had finally found her authentic self. And yet a year later, that authentic self was no longer relevant as she returned to feminine pronouns. So obviously this was not really a process of self-discovery. And this is going to be a recurring theme as we explore some contemporary trends in how people are reconceptualizing the idea of gender. But first, let's talk about transgender and the experience of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a sense that there is incongruity between one's biological sex and a gender that they identify with. Gender dysphoria is a real human experience. And there are different approaches and responses to the experience of gender dysphoria. One is to validate perceptions and narratives of the experience, which is the default response in modern Western society. But another is to explore narratives of the experience and possible contributing factors. So at one extreme, we validate nothing. We simply deny the reality of someone's experience. And at the other extreme, we validate everything. We indulge any thought process, any feeling that they have about their experience. And we end up denying some realities in that process as well. These are the two extremes that people tend to in modern society. And as we talk about questions around this term transgender, we need to make some important distinctions. These things are not the same. The experience of gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia, intersex conditions, autogynephilia, which is where someone experiences sexual arousal, seeing themselves presented as the opposite gender. Rapid onset gender dysphoria, and this is usually the product of social influences. And then there's TikTok facilitated gender identity, gender performance as fetish, or gender claiming for convenience. These are all experiences and behaviors that are sometimes lumped under this umbrella term of trans, but they are absolutely not all the same thing. And let's have an important discussion about intersex conditions. And this is taken from the website of the Intersex Society of North America. They say intersex is a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definitions of female or male. Though we speak of intersex as an inborn condition, intersex anatomy doesn't always show up at birth. Sometimes a person isn't found to have intersex anatomy until she or he reaches the age of puberty, or finds himself an infertile adult, or dies of old age and is autopsied. Some people live and die with intersex anatomy without anyone, including themselves, ever knowing. The truth is that the vast majority of people with intersex conditions identify as male or female, rather than transgender or transsexual. Thus, where all people who identify as transgender or transsexual experience problems with their gender identity, only a small portion of intersex people experience these problems. A knowledgeable friend of mine wrote that while some transgender activists attempt to conflate the trans phenomenon with intersex conditions, theorizing, for example, that they may have an intersex brain or some as yet undiscovered deviation from the typical sex binary, Transgender and intersex conditions are distinct conditions and not at all the same thing. There are some tests that purport to show trans people that they have, for example, male anatomy, but a female brain. In fact, these studies are measuring gender nonconformity, and most homosexual men, as well as a fair number of heterosexual men, would also score high on this measure. It's a classic type 1 error. And this speaks to the problem of science. As we look for a scientific explanation or basis for the transgender phenomenon, we find a lot of conflicting views that invoke different forms of data and treat data in different ways. And then we have some views that say that science shouldn't get involved at all. And the reasoning that they provide is that if science is able to identify some physiological phenomenon that results in the transgender experience, then some people might try to use science to remedy the transgender experience, which would violate some deeply held beliefs among a lot of people in the transgender community about the sanctity of their transgender identity. Now, for a couple of faithful voices on this issue, I recommend a couple of talks and discussions that happened in the 2022 North Star Conference, and I have links to these here in the presentation and at Nauvoo Neighbor. And now let's talk for a moment about experience and narrative, because I'm going to use this word narrative a lot in this series. And I'm using the term narrative to describe stories or thought processes that we employ to explain our life experiences. Buddhism has a really interesting concept around narratives, and it's the principle of the second arrow. Buddhism teaches that life sometimes gives us unexpected adversity, which can feel like being struck by an arrow out of nowhere. But instead of mindfully working to remove that arrow and heal the wound, we sometimes create narratives about the arrow. And those might be that life is unfair, the world hates me, I'm a failure, or that the wound is my identity. And those narratives amount to a second self-inflicted arrow wound. Let's look at this in practice, in the case of somebody who used to identify as transgender. This Twitter user, Michelle, created a series of posts about her experience. She said, "When I was making the decision to transition, I came up with a list of evidence that I felt explained why I was not a woman and was somehow a man instead. I now have better explanations for everything on that list." And if you look over to the right at this graphic under the heading Identity, you can see that she had adopted a narrative, "It's because I'm trans," that explained a lot of her life experiences at the time. That single narrative was something that she turned to explain everything. She continues, "Against all traditional knowledge, my healthcare professionals were convinced that affirmation was the only ethical route to take. In doing so, they confirmed a delusional belief and prescribed an unnecessary treatment, the effects of which I will live with forever." She says, "I take full responsibility for my part in my mistake, but I will never concede that the authorities who advised me were innocent. This is medical negligence, not buyer's remorse." And you can see under the heading of understanding, she went through the process of actually questioning that narrative and did some self-exploration and was able to come up with much better explanations for those life experiences. Narratives are very, very powerful things. And we have a lot of people in the transgender community who have adopted narratives and held on to those narratives for decades. But to illustrate how powerful those are, imagine a hypothetical scenario where somebody, for whatever reason, is unable to remember their own internal narratives, including ones they may have adopted about gender. There are actual examples of this, and let's talk about that. Here's an academic paper that talks about dementia patients who end up forgetting a lot of things, including their internal narratives. Well, what happens if a dementia patient has had a narrative of gender throughout their life? Let's read what these authors say. They say, "There is little research at the international level to help us understand the experiences and needs of trans people living with dementia. despite population aging and the growing numbers of trans people, including the first cohort of trans older adults. There is a need to understand the widespread barriers, discrimination, and mistreatment faced by trans people in the health and social service system, and the fears trans people express about aging and dementia. Anecdotal evidence from the scarce literature on the topic of LGBTQ populations and dementia suggests that cognitive changes can impact on gender identity. For example, trans older adults with dementia may forget they transitioned and re-identify with their sex or gender assigned at birth, or may experience gender confusion. And they go on to reference there's a gap in current literature. I've highlighted these references here, where they mention that there's very little in the way of studies that explore these phenomena. And the reason for that is it's very politically fraught to question a lot of the dominant narratives around gender in our day. But this is a real phenomenon that is observable among some dementia patients. Let's read a case study. In this case, a 76-year-old female transgender person was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia in 2014. It says she underwent male-to-female gender reassignment surgery, including bilateral breast surgery completed in the 1960s, and hormonal treatment with estradiol. She considered her sexual orientation to be towards the same sex, and she was in a long-term relationship with a female partner. And it says there was no other significant psychiatric history. This was an individual born male who transitioned to female and then identified as lesbian and had a long-term female partner. This individual then, in an assisted living environment, was being treated for dementia. And it says she resided in her own flat and her partner lived in a separate flat in the same block. In 2018, she started wandering and bringing men to her flat and engaging with them in sexual activities. So with dementia, first, we see a disruption in understanding of this individual's sexual orientation. And then, in the unit, she presented with insomnia, agitation, dysphasia, having sexually inappropriate conversations with staff about being interested in men, which was a continuation of new behavior that was identified in the community, as well as making innuendos to female members of staff, while talking about herself as a man. She presented with toileting behavior that would identify her as male gender, for example, standing to urinate as if using a urinal, interpreted as reversal toward biological gender identification. Her partner felt devastated by behaviors exhibited by the patient, which could be identified as male gender-based behavior aligned with biological gender by birth. So think through the implications of this. This is an individual who probably spent decades in this new experience of gender and sexuality, and probably many times said, "This is who I really am. I've discovered my true self. I'm living my truth." But what happens when those narratives are gone? In this case, the individual reverted to behaviors associated with their biological sex. Let's explore another dimension of this. There was a New York Times article during the COVID pandemic, and look at the title of it. How do I define my gender if no one is watching me? In this case, this individual has adopted a gender construct that exists in the minds of other people. And without the constant validation and affirmation of other people, this individual doesn't know who they are. There's a YouTube content creator account called Call Me Sam, which is an individual in this situation. And Sam was a man who transitioned to femaleness and lived that way for decades. But at one point, Sam moved into a secluded location in Scotland, away from any people. And that means people who could affirm Sam's experience of gender. And what happened during that time was Sam began to question his narratives that he had held to, that had caused him to modify his body. And in these YouTube videos, he talks through things that he learned and experienced during that process of developing a better self-understanding. It is very painful to listen to him reprocess his life experiences and question his narratives. He ended up desisting in his transition. And as he talks through it, again, I'll say it's very painful to listen to. It's also very graphic, and I don't recommend watching these videos with children nearby. But there are some very profound insights and even revelatory experiences that he had that helped him to become comfortable again with his biological sex. Sam's experience is like many others that give good reason for us to question the affirmation-only response to people's understanding of gender. There are a lot of problems with affirmation-only. We have statistics showing a sharp rise in young people identifying as transgender in the United States. We have people identifying as another gender in order to engage in predatory behaviors. Here's a social media post. A friend told me recently that her rapid onset gender dysphoria boys have been partly affected by all the talk about toxic masculinity. Many sensitive boys probably hate macho male culture and have been groomed to believe they can transition out of it to be women. And here we have a doctor giving a presentation and saying, so what we do know is that adolescents actually have the capacity to make a reasoned, logical decision. And here's the other thing about chest surgery. If you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go and get them. This is a doctor providing medical advice that adolescents are capable of making profoundly life-changing decisions, like body modification. And then we have a story of trans prisoners switching gender again, once freed from women's units. In other words, males identifying as female in order to be placed in women's prisons, and upon their release, reverting back to their male gender identity. These are only some of the indicators that there are serious, serious problems in the affirmation-only approach to gender identity. And when it comes to social media, we need to ask this question, where does it lead? Look at these TikTok accounts, one of them identifying as aroace and lesbian with sub-identities. Another one responding to a question, what's the difference between this and demi-boy? And this person identifies as something called Libra mask. And finally, someone identifying as agender, saying, you might identify as non-binary because you don't feel male or female, but the key thing is you don't feel in the middle between male or female either, which some non-binary people do. Are these healthy behaviors, and what is your limiting principle? Do you have a limiting principle, or do you just think that all of these behaviors should be indulged, regardless of their impact on people's psychological health? And now let's turn to another case study, and this is a really important story. This is a psychologist who wrote a letter to her daughter's gender therapist. And let's read it. To my daughter's gender therapist, you were wrong. It has been some months since you and my daughter had the last of 4 sessions. In the 3rd session, I was invited to sit in on a discussion of the effects of T, testosterone, on a human female body. You smiled calmly as you led us through a series of PowerPoint slides explaining that my daughter's reproductive organs would atrophy, that she would grow a beard, that her voice would deepen, and that the quote-unquote phallus would become enlarged. I sat listening, summoning all of my own skills as a clinical psychologist to not let a tirade loose at you in front of my brittle and fragile 17-year-old. Between your 3rd and 4th and final sessions with my daughter, you and I had a one-on-one conversation wherein I believe you recognized that this mother and this family were not going to easily or willingly surrender this child to whatever gender transition services you were prepared to refer her for after just 3 45-minute meetings. I asked what it was specifically about my daughter that convinced you that medical transition would be the right course of action to relieve her distress. You said, he has gender dysphoria. I said, she has an eating disorder, body dysmorphia, and ADHD, all of which seem to have some overlapping features with gender dysphoria. Why wouldn't you assess for and treat those before triggering any kind of medical intervention? She goes on to say, a critically important thing that we learned along the way is that my daughter, as many other young people who declare transgender identity in adolescence, is on the autism spectrum. She was diagnosed by an experienced child and adolescent psychiatrist and is now coming to understand how certain aspects of her autism resulted in collapsing and narrowing her focus into gender identity as a way of explaining and coping with what made life so difficult for her during her middle and high school years. She is learning to reconcile with being socially awkward and having idiosyncratic interests, and will be better for it as she inhabits her full adult self sometime in her late 20s. She is a brilliant and beautiful human being whose entire future came so close to being stolen from her by the gender transition industry. It is alarming that an entire generation of gifted children who may be on the autism spectrum is being sterilized in what amounts to a eugenics experiment with the participation of big-name medical and professional institutions, and to the benefit of a novel category of mental health practitioners, gender therapists like you. It is now September, and my daughter and I have been living in a city in the former Soviet Union as of mid-August. She is connecting to her roots, her land, and her cultural heritage, to rich and lasting sources of identity that synthetic hormones and manufactured gender ideology were threatening to undermine and replace. She recognizes that going down the path of medical transition would have made her into a lifelong patient, as well as holding her back from so much joy and freedom that she now has access to. She is coming to terms with the inevitable losses that growing up brings, and discovering facets of herself that she never would have if we had taken your advice and initiated medicalization. Gender ideology would have had to become the central focus of her intellect and creativity for the rest of her life. Think about how many kids are going to therapists without the benefit of having a mother like this who can see through the things that are being told to adolescents who are claiming trans identity. This is another reason why the Affirm-Only model is so problematic. But let's look at another phenomenon that shares this problem of the Affirm-Only model, and that's body integrity disorder. This is an individual with a healthy body who believes that her authentic self is paralyzed, and she is looking for a way to get a surgery to paralyze her body so that she can live disabled, because she feels that that is her authentic self. She says, I'd always had these feelings that I'm supposed to be more disabled than I actually am. This is who you are. You need to be your authentic self.
It really hit me hard after I had a skiing accident. I'd always had these feelings that I was supposed to be more disabled than I actually am. And then I became a little more disabled in exactly the way that I was supposed to be. Some partial paralysis in my left leg, loss of sensation, etc. And it was totally like a wake-up call from the universe. It's like, hey, you need to take this seriously. This is who you are. You need to be your authentic self and stop pretending that you're something other than you are. And I am a person who is supposed to use a wheelchair.
If someone wants surgery to become paralyzed, does that cross a line for you? What is your limiting principle when it comes to validating someone's self-perception? Would you deny this person a surgery to paralyze their own body? If yes, why? And if not, then why not? What is your limiting principle here? And now I want to talk about another phenomenon. And we see it in this trailer for a new documentary coming out for a movie called Affirmation Generation. As you watch this, listen for references to self-harm, because this is something that is often threatened in conversations with people who question another person's gender identity.
Based on the information that I had, that medical transition is by far the best treatment and that you are at risk for suicide if you don't follow that path.
The therapist said I'm automatically transgender, and she had my letter to transition right away after my first session with her.
Autism, childhood sexual abuse, internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny. There's just so many reasons that people transition and end up later regretting it.
It seems like all of this is based on the fear that if you don't affirm a child's identity right away, they're going to be at a high risk of suicide.
It's just not true. And in fact, those who had transitioned had suicide rates 19 times higher than population-matched controls.
These vulnerable people were treated incredibly badly by the professionals.
I saw one of those therapists for probably about an hour, and he wrote a letter recommending testosterone for me. I will never be able to breastfeed.
Like I said, I have to now live with what I've done.
We need to be really clear here. Emotionally abusive language is often employed in the affirmation model to extort people and organizations into compliance, saying things like, if someone doesn't agree with my perceptions, do what I want, or give me what I demand, then I'll harm myself. Or look at what you made them do. Or if I hurt myself, it's your fault. This is language of abusers, people who try to get their way through emotional extortion and manipulation. It is never, ever okay to participate in validating abusive behavior like this, or narratives of suicidal ideation. And I offer for further reading, there's a really great article that explores this phenomenon in the trans movement. But now we are seeing some trends around affirmation that are kind of interesting. England, Sweden, and Finland are leading a change in course away from affirm-only approaches to gender identity. And U.S. organizations are resisting this shift, but there are signs of some amount of recognition of the problem. A lot of this is coming from lawsuits and just a lot of people's observations of the damage that the affirm-only model has caused, especially among young people. So as with our presentation on identity, I want to reiterate that in situations where someone is struggling, and in this context, a situation might be that somebody is struggling over their gender perception. In these situations, our instincts toward empathy are valuable in helping us to narrow our focus to relieving the suffering of other people. But once again, one individual's suffering and that empathic response can sometimes blind us to very, very important and relevant dimensions of reality. And some people might claim that this narrow empathic response is the only relevant dimension of reality here, but that is not true. And prophets in their role have the responsibility of operating in reality for the benefit of people under their stewardship. They cannot avoid the bigger picture of reality, regardless of whether we, sometimes even with good intentions, are determined to avoid reality. So again, if your views of gender conflict with those taught by the prophets in the Family Proclamation, the question to ask is, are your views informed by the larger picture of reality that they are seeing? And let's conclude here by acknowledging that gender is experienced in different ways, sometimes with frustration and deep confusion. The world has adopted an affirm-only response to people's perceptions of gender identity, but there are very good reasons to question and challenge the affirm-only approach. And as with basic questions of identity, critics of the Family Proclamation bear the burden of demonstrating how the affirm-only approach is more grounded in basic scientific and psychological reality than are the Church's teachings. And finally, let's reiterate, this issue is complex and very personal. We need to understand that as we navigate these situations, we can't expect that everyone will get it right all the time. Even as we adhere to principles, we need to offer grace and charity and be a loving community that creates a healthy environment for people to work through their challenges in the best ways possible. And finally, I want to go back to this slide from our previous presentation in the series and talk about kindness and reality. Love means working toward the well-being of others, not pretending that reality is something other than what it is. People who love us will be honest with us and help us to live well in reality. And again, I want to quote Thomas Keating. He says that God approaches us from many different perspectives: illness, misfortune, bankruptcy, divorce proceedings, rejection, and inner trials. God has not promised to take away our trials, but to help us to change our attitudes toward them. That is what holiness really is. In this life, happiness is rooted in our basic attitude toward reality. This has been a very challenging exploration of a difficult topic. And in part 3, we're going to focus on marriage in the Family Proclamation. Again, I want to remind you that these slides and more resources are available at navuneighbor.org, and the link is in the description for this video here on YouTube. Thank you for joining me.